everybody. Thank you for coming. Okay. So today I wanted to learn with you a study in what I call intertextuality and reverse intertextuality, which are very fancy words for how Chazal in the Midrash, how they read text and where they saw things that ultimately, I think, reflect a very deep understanding of the Pshat, even though at first blush it doesn't seem at all like Pshat, and then how they went back and reread stories. And I wanted to take as a case example, the very famous, in fact, I can use the word iconic, a story of Abraham the Iconclast. Abraham, who in the Jewish tradition is known as the one who destroys his father's idols, which is a story that many of us study, even though it's clearly not in Tanakh. It's not in the stories of Abraham. And I want to try to tease out why we're doing it. So I'd like to look at one version of the story, actually two versions of the story, and then talk about where I believe that it came from, and then try to tease that out. Okay, so that's the goal today. That's the goal of our learning today. Okay, this class is Abraham the Iconclast. This is Rabbi Nathaniel Helfgot at the Yemei Iyun, the 22nd Yemei Iyun on Bible, Jewish thought, and Talmud. So this famous story appears in a number of rabbinic sources. The most famous one, the one that most of us have either studied directly or have studied indirectly, is from Bereshit Rabbah. Bereshit Rabbah, the main rabbinic midrash on Sefer Bereshit, on the book of Genesis, probably edited sometime between the mid-3rd century and the mid-4th century in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel. It's an Eretz Yisrael midrash. It comes from the Amoraic period, right? It's after the Mishnah. It's a post-Mishnaic work, but it includes material which is prior to that period, right? Just because something is edited late doesn't mean that it doesn't have material that's much earlier. But in terms of its final edition, it's edited in Eretz Yisrael, sometime between the 3rd and the 4th century. So it's commenting on the verse at the end of Parshat Bereshit. Vayamat Haran, and you have the English here, for those who like English. I'm just going to read it in Hebrew. Vayamat Haran al pnei terach aviv, Rabbi Chia berei de Rav Ada diafo. Terach oved slamim hayad. Terach, the father of Abraham, was an idolater. Chadzman nafik la'atar. One time he had to go to the city. He had to go to purchase. Hoshiv l'Avraham mocher tachtav. So instead, he left Abraham to mind the store. Havi'ati bar inish bait zvin. A person came in to buy. Vava amar le bar kama shninad. And Abraham said, "How old are you?" Vava amar le bar chamishin oshitin. I'm about 50 or 60. They didn't know exactly. They didn't have, like today, you ask somebody, I don't know, maybe I'm 80, maybe I'm 85. There were no, no birth certificates. So Abraham said, he's not a very good salesman. He says, woe to this man that he's 60 years old, and he's bowing down to something that was created a day ago. You've been around 60 years, and you're bowing down to this thing that was made in China, a few weeks ago. Okay. Vami mitbayesh, and the man was embarrassed, v'holechlo, and he left. Chadzman, the second time, once atachad itzisa, a woman came. Ti'ina biyade chadapinach desolet. She had a certain amount of solet, a certain amount of flour, fine flour, solet, fine flour. And so she had a certain amount of fine flour. Amrale halach krav kadman. Here, come and take this and offer it as a sacrifice to the idols. Come nesiv buklasa biyade v'tavrahum lekulan psilaya. So, interesting. There's a kind of non sequitur in the Midrash. He then takes a stick. I mean, what does the stick have to do with this? The woman comes. To the woman, he doesn't give a lot of musar. She just kind of comes, leaves the korban. I guess because she wasn't buying anything. She was, if you bought something, then he would have given you a musar shmooze. But she wasn't buying anything. So he comes, and he says this. Amrle. So he comes, and he takes a stick, Abraham, and he destroys all the idols. And he put the stick in the hand of the biggest, the Rabbah, the biggest of the idols. When his father came home, who did this? Now we explain the business of the flour. A woman came and brought some flour. The idols started to fight. I want it first. And so the biggest one came, took its stick, and broke the other ones. So the father says, Amar le mata maflebi. What are you joking me? What are you, maflebi? What are you making a joke? You're insulting me? V'yadin inun. Do they know anything? They're idols. They don't know anything. Amar le. So Avram said, V'lo yishmu aznecha ma shepicha. Omer, don't your ears, don't they hear what you're saying? Interesting. Until now, it's all been in Aramaic. All of a sudden, there's a Hebrew phrase, which is very interesting. If we were studying Midrash independently, we'd have to try to go into that. Why does the shift from Aramaic to Hebrew dafka at this point?
Do we know how old Abraham is, by the way, at this point?
No, we don't know. But he's certainly old enough to run a store. So he can open the store, close the store, right? So he's not a baby. In this version, right, we don't know how old he is. He's a son. He's a young man. And at this point, the Midrash continues and tells the rest of the story, which is, of course, the story that Abraham is put into danger. Nasve, so according to this version, Terach seized him and brought him to Nimrod. Misare le Nimrod. The father gives him over to Nimrod.
I think there are other versions about how this...
Yeah, there are a lot of other versions, but this is the most...
Here it's the same, but after this it diverges?
There are There are other versions of this also, but again, and I'll show you another version in a second. Amrle niskod lenura. So Nimrod says, bow down to the fire. Amrle Avram v'niskod lemaya. We should, this is Chad Gadya. We should bow down to the water, which puts out the fire. Amrle Nimrod niskod lemaya. Let's go bow. Amrle niskod la'anana. We should bow down to the clouds that have the water. Lebar inish the savel rucha. We should bow down to human beings who stand up to the wind. And at that point, Nimrod says, I'm only gonna bow down to the fire. You're just playing with me. I'm going to throw you in. Once again into Hebrew. Let him save you. Havataman Haran Kaim Pelug. And this is the famous story of Haran decides, whose side am I on? Am I on Abraham's side, etc. This is the very famous version of the Midrash. Again, 3rd century of the Common Era when it's edited. But as I mentioned to you, this Midrash seems to have a much older provenance. If you turn the page, just to show you a non-rabbinic text, the Book of Jubilees, for those who don't know what that is, the Book of Jubilees is part of the Apocrypha, right? Books that were written during the Second Temple period, Kufat Beit Sheni, that did not make it into the Tanakh. These are books that were read and studied by Jews, some of them very frum Jews in our language, some of them sectarian Jews, but they were holy books for them. Chazal called them Sfarim Chitzoniyim, the books that are outside of the canon. So here's a classic example. Book of Jubilees, we found copies or parts of them in the Qumran caves, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which tells you that there are at least, many of them are at least 100 before the Common Era, meaning 300 or 400 years before the Midrash, the editing of our Midrash. So we have, this is an ancient tradition. Let's read it and notice in the book of Jubilees. It came to pass in the 6th week, in the 7th year thereof, the 6th Shemitah, that Abram said to Terach his father, saying, Father, and he said, Hineni, my son, but what help and profit have we from the idols which thou dost worship, and before which thou dost bow thyself? For there is no spirit in them, for they are dumb forms and a misleading of the heart. Worship them not, worship the God of heaven who causes the rain and the dew. Again, you have the rain theme here, the ananim. Why do you worship these things that have no spirit in them? For they are the work of human beings. And his father said to him, I also know it, my son. But what shall I do with the people who have made me to serve before them? Which is very similar, because in the Midrash he also says, oh, can one idol really fight with it? They don't have any. They're not real. It's just a game. But again, the father says, I have public pressure. If I tell them the truth, they will slay me, for their slow cleaves them to them to worship them and honor them. Keep silent, my son, lest they slay thee. And these words he spake to his two brothers, etc., etc. And if you skip to line 14, and in the 60th year of the life of Abraham, you asked about how old Abraham is. In the book of Jubilees, they have it that Abraham is 60. The 4th week in the 4th year thereof, Abraham arose by night and burned the house of the idols. And he burned all that was in the house, and no man knew it. And they arose in the night and sought to save their gods from the midst of the fire, etc., etc. So fascinating. So this tradition of Abraham the Iconclast is a very ancient tradition. It's a very old tradition that exists within Second Temple literature. Okay. So the question, of course, is, where in heaven's name did Chazal, or whoever proto-Chazal, whoever, created this tradition, get it from? There is zero evidence in Parshas Noach, or Parshas, or Parshas, Lech Lecha, of any story like this. The fact that Terach was an Oved Avodah Zarah is mentioned in Tanakh, right? We cited in the Haggadah, right? Mitchila Ovdei Avodah Zarah Haya Avotenu, and it talks about Terach, Abraham, etc. But this idea, where does it come from? Now, I understand the motivation for it. There are two motivations why someone would write a very beautiful story like this. Again, just parenthetically, for those who are, not well versed in the tradition, I come from the tradition of Rov Rishonim, Rov Gaonim, Rov Achronim, that does not believe that the narrative parts in the Midrash are necessarily historically accurate. We come from the tradition that is, certainly today, the dominant tradition within the modern Orthodox community was the dominant tradition of the Gaonim, Rambam, Ramban, almost all of the classical Achronim, that when it comes to the narrative stories in the Midrash, you can accept some of them as historically accurate. You don't have to accept. As a teacher of mine once said, every Midrash should be taken seriously. Not every Midrash should be taken literally. And this is a great example of many, right? We have no evidence for this historically. But why would someone construct such a story? And the answer is very simple. Two reasons. One is because we want to have an origin story. Anybody that studies comics knows that every superhero needs an origin story. How did the Flash become the Flash? How did Superman become Superman? How did Hercules become Hercules? And how did Abraham become Abraham? Because when you read Tanakh, Abraham just kind of pops up on the scene. There is no origin story in Tanakh for Abraham. As opposed to, let's say, we know about the birth of other we know about Moshe, how he's born, in a very difficult situation and how he's saved. And then we see all kinds of interesting things about baby Moshe, and then we see about Moshe the teenager, and then we see Moshe the adult. So we have an origin story, number one. Number two, we have no reason why Abraham is chosen explicitly at the beginning. It just says, Lech lo mi'artzcha. Why? Right? With Yirmiyahu, Hashem comes to Yirmiyahu and says, B'terem yida'aticha, yitzarticha, b'beten yida'aticha. I knew you in the womb. With Moshe, we may maybe that's why the Bible tells us those stories about Moshe saving this one and saving that one, and he's Mr. Justice, right? He intercedes. Jews, non-Jews, Jews. He's always interceding on behalf of the one who's the chalash, the one who's... But Abraham, we don't know. Now the truth is we do know, but it doesn't appear here. It appears later on in Parshat Vayera, when Hashem says to Abraham, I have to tell him about why I'm going to destroy Sodom. Ki da'ativ l'man asher yitzaved banav la'asot tzedakah u'mishpat. I know that he is a person who is a person of tzedakah mishpat, and he's going to raise his children that way, so I have to tell him. It seems that's the pshat understanding of why Abraham is chosen, because he's Mr. tzedakah mishpat. That's why Abraham hangs out with a guy named Melchizedek, as opposed to hanging out with Sodom, with Melech Sodom, who's named Bera and Birsha. Much better to have friends who have names like Melchizedek than to have, Mr. Evil and Dr. Terrible, and Mr. Horrible, right? You don't want to hang out with those kind of people. Okay. But is there more on a pshat level? Because this story doesn't appear. And the answer is yes, I believe. Because this story does appear in Tanakh, it just doesn't appear in terms of Abraham. If everyone opens their Tanakh to Gideon, to Parshat to Sefer Shoftim, the book of Judges, in chapter 6, we have a very famous judge. His name was Gideon. Gideon. In chapter 6.
You said for me?
I'm sorry? Parak Vav.
Shoftim.
Shoftim. That's what Gideon is. So if you remember the narrative of Gideon, just to put it into context, Gideon is a judge who lives at a time of very great danger to the future of the Jewish people in the land of Israel. Gideon lives when the Midianites have the upper hand. The Jews are hiding in caves, which is talk about having no sovereignty. If you have to hide in caves in your own land, it means you're not really sovereign in your own land. And Gideon has a visit from an angel. And I want to, very famous story. And Gideon sees the angel, but I want to go to the other story. After he sees the angel, in verse 25, chapter 6, verse 25, Vahi b'layla it was that night. Very interesting, that night. Remember that in the book of Jubilees, the tradition has it as, it happened at night. Vayomer lo Hashem, kach et par hashor asher la'avicha, take the shore of your father, upar hashenisha, veharasta et mizbach haBaal, and go and destroy the mizbeach of the Baal. Asher la'avicha, that's your father's, vet ashera asher alav tichrot. Ubanita mizbeach l'Hashem lokecha rosh ha'ma'oz hazeh b'maracha v'lakachta et hapar sheni v'alita olav b'atzei ashera asher tichros. Go and destroy the Mizbeach of the Baal and the Asherah. Go and destroy the altar of the Avodah Zarah. The Baal was the storm god. Asherah in the Canaanite pantheon was the consort of the Baal. The Asherah was the consort of the Baal. And go and destroy it at night. And whose Mizbeach is it? The Bible chooses to tell us it's the Papa Bear's Mizbeach. Go and destroy your father's idols at night. Vayikach Gidon 10 nashim me'avadav, vayas kasher ber Hashem elav, vayhi kasher yared beit aviv and nashei ha'ir mi'asot yomam vayas halayla. He was afraid of his relatives, and he was afraid of the townspeople. Vayashkimu anshei ha'ir baboker. And in the morning, the people got up. V'hineinu tatz mizbach ha'bal asher alav, v'tapar shni al mizbeach panui, v'imru ish al re'eu, mi asa hadavar hazeh? Who did this? And they discovered, Ki natatzet mizbach habal v'chi karata asherah. Vayomer Yoash l'chol asher amdu alav. And they found out. Vayidrishu. Vayomru Gidon ben Yoash asat hadavar hazeh. The papa bear, the child of Yoash, Gidon, has done this. Parenthetically, his name. What's Gidon's other name? You know, he's Yerubal. He's the one who fights with the Baal. But what's the name Gidon? Gidon. What does it come? What's the root of the word Gidon? Gadag. Gimel Dalid Ayin. Anybody know where that appears in Tanakh? In Sefer Dvarim, right? Et mizbechotechem teharsun. What's the pasuk? Tigadeun. What is it? What's the pasuk? Et mizbechotechem tigadeun. And in the book of Deuteronomy, when it talks about idolatry in the land of Israel, you have to be migadeya, which means to cut off and destroy the mizbachot, which is exactly what he does. Kishmo Kainhu. Names in Tanakh are always about meaning; they're not just names. So he's Mr. Gidon. He destroys the Avodah Zarah. But what happens? They look for him. Vayamru anshe ha'ir el Yoash. So the people say to Yoash, Hotzeyet bincha, give us your son. V'yamot, he should die. Ki natatzet mizbach habal v'chikarat asher hashalah, because he destroyed the Avodah Zarah. Vayomer Yoash l'chol asher amdu alav. He mocks them, even though it was his Avodah Zarah. And yet he mocks them. Ha'atem terivun labal? Im atem toshiuno to asher ariv lo yumat ad boker. Im Elohimu yarev lo ki natatzet mizbecho. If he's really a God, let him defend himself. Vayikra lo bayom ahu Yerubal lemor yarev bo habal ki natatzet mizbecho. Let the Baal fight him because he destroyed. So let's summarize this little type scene that we just saw in the book of Tanakh. We have a papa bear and a baby bear. We have Yoash and Gidon, Terach and Abraham. We have a situation where the father is the owner of the idols and the son destroys the idols of the papa bear. We have a situation in which the son is put in harm's way because of the destruction of the idols. Gidon is in harm's way because of the destruction of the idols. In the book of Jubilees, we have that this occurs at night because it's dangerous to do it during the day. This occurs at night. They want to kill the son, but the father... I'm sorry, and in the Gidon story, there is a mocking of the Avodah Zarah. There is a mocking of the idolatry. And in the story, that's the version both in the Midrash and in the version in the book of Jubilees, there is a mocking of the idols. It is 100% clear to me that Chazal, or even the proto-Chazal, whoever created this narrative about the origin story of Abraham, used the template of Gidon to create the narrative of Abraham. It may, now, I do want to be honest, you could, in a more radical vein, I think this is more radical, say that maybe for thousands of years these oral traditions about Abraham were floating around, and whoever wrote the book of Shoftim decided to put them into Gidon. That's another way to take it. I'm not sure. I actually take, because the way I see it, it's, you need to have evidence for that much more than this. That's a much more radical claim. But then the question, of course, becomes, okay, that's very nice, but why? Of all the origin stories in Tanakh, did the proto-rabbis and the rabbis who were comfortable with this, because they integrated it into their own literature, meaning even if this is an external idea that came from outside of rabbinic circles, even though that term is a kind of anachronism, what does it mean to be a rabbinic circle in the 4th century BCE? We don't really have rabbis in the way that we have them much later, but maybe this idea, why did they feel so comfortable integrating this story? And the answer, I believe, is what I call reverse intertextuality, which means that the rabbis read the book of Shoftim very carefully, and they noticed something very interesting about the way that the Tanakh presents Gidon. So let's go back to the Gidon narrative. If everybody opens up their Tanakh to chapter 6.
When you do this, could you show me where Yoash owns these idols?
It says that it's his Mizbeach. It says, God says to him, "Vayi balai lahu, vayomer lo Hashem, kach et parashor asher le'avicha, upara sheni sheva sheni varasta mizbach habal asher le'avicha."
Got it, thank you.
I think that's pretty clear.
Yeah.
Asher le'avicha.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's go back to the beginning of the narrative of Gidon and read it carefully. Right? So we have a situation in which the Jewish people are in big trouble. And the text says in chapter 6, verse 6, Vayidal Yisrael ma'od mipnei Midyan. Vayiz'aku b'nei Yisrael el Hashem. Vayhi ki za'aku b'nei Yisrael el Hashem al odot Midyan. Vayishlach Hashem ish navi el b'nei Yisrael lemkom Hashem, etc., etc. I saved you. And God now says, don't be afraid. And now in verse 11, and I'm going to start, as we read it, I'm going to start to note the parallels that the Bible presents between Gidon and Abraham. Vayavo malach Hashem. An angel appears to Abraham. Vayeshev tachat ha'elah. He sits under a tree. Boy, that's very familiar. Remember anything about angels coming and sitting under trees?
Three
Angels. Here it's one angel, but they sit under Hishanu Tachat Ha'etz. Asher li'oash avi ha'ezri, v'gid'on b'no chovet chitim. Vayari lav malach Hashem, v'yom lav imcha ha'gibor ha'chayil. V'yomer lav Gid'on bi adoni v'yesh adonai imanu, v'lo mitzatanu kol zot, v'yei kol niflo'otav. Where? Vayifen elav Hashem, vayelech lech v'oshat yisom mikaf midyan halo shlachticha. And he says, how can I save the Jewish people? And he says, don't worry. Don't worry, I'm going to go with you. Al nat tamush mizeh ad bo yelech, v'tzeit min chati, v'hinachta lefanecha, v'yomer anochi yeshev ad shuvcha. V'Gidon ba, Vayas gedi izim ve'efat kemach matzot habasar sam basal v'hamarak sam befarur ve'etzei lav el tachat ha'elav vayigash. He brings them matzot. He brings them kemach matzot and meat and marak and soup underneath the tree. Again, this is very, very interesting to me. Gidon offers the angels food, and the food consists, let's remind ourselves, if we go back to the book of Genesis, we remind ourselves in the book of Genesis, as follows. It says that in Parshat Va'era, so the Bible says, stay here, have some drink, etc., etc. And he brings them this food, and it's interesting, of course, just in passing, I'm sure many of us remember the Rashi that we learned when we were little kids. In the story of Abraham and the angels, the Bible says that this took place on Erev Pesach. Guess what the Midrash says this took place? The Gidon story on also Erev Pesach.
Where does the Bible say it took place in Erev Pesach?
Didn't say the Bible. I said the Midrash.
Sorry.
Said the word Midrash. The Midrash notices that he comes and he brings these shlosh se'im kemach solet, and he brings these things to them, and it assumes that it's Pesach. Why it assumes it's Pesach is a very interesting question. Rav Yoel ben Nun has written about it, and other people have written about this, but he brings them this. The Midrash in the story of Gidon says the same thing, that this occurred on Erev Pesach. Yes?
When Avraham was alive, there was no Pesach.
Of course not. It's a Midrashic reading into the story.
It doesn't make sense.
Of course it doesn't make sense if you're superficial, or if you go deeper. Read the article by Rav Yoel ben Nun. You can go Google about Pesach Lot and Pesach Mitzrayim, and you'll see why the rabbis were doing something very interesting here about what happened in Sodom and what happened with Abraham. A lot of interesting parallels. Yes?
Rashi also says it was Pesach because Lot gives them matzot.
Correct. Lot later on gives them matzot. Correct. Which is, of course, but again, that's just the surface. It's much deeper than that. The connections the rabbis noticed. And so you have here echoes. Then the text continues, and the text tells us that night, right? We just read the story. It's very interesting. Chapter 6, verse 26. Vayikach Gidon Asara Anashim. Fascinating. He takes 10 people. That's very interesting. There are 10 people in this place called Ophrah willing to destroy the Avodah Zarah. Boy, that's very evocative. Reminds me of another place where you were looking for 10 good men. Couldn't even find 10 good men. Gidon at least could find 10 good men. And if you go through, see if I can find some other, just wanted to see some other things. Just 1 second. Okay. Okay, so if you look, I'm sure, if you look through the rest of the Gidon narrative, you'll find other parallels, hints that the author of the book of Shoftim kind of models some of the type scenes that we see with Gidon to Abraham. That he's a kind of second Abraham in certain ways, in terms of affirming, in terms of maintaining the Jewish people in the land of Israel. And therefore, I believe that the rabbis, seeing that the text of Shoftim modeled some of the life of Gidon on the life of Abraham, so they said, okay, so if Gidon is based on Abraham, maybe we can go the other way, and Abraham can be based on Gidon. That if we're looking to understand the character, that's what I call reverse intertextuality. That if we learn about a later biblical figure and see echoes of it in the text from an earlier biblical figure, the rabbi said, well, that means they're connected. And if they're connected, maybe we can also go, if we can go uptown, maybe we can go downtown as well, and we can go the other way in terms of fashioning the life and times of a certain person. Let me give you another beautiful example, okay? We have Abraham. Let's stick with Abraham and go to the Akedat Yitzchak. Let's go to the narrative of the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. Chapter 22, one of the most exalted narratives in all of Tanakh. Vayhi achar hadvarim ha'eleh, v'ha'elohim nisa et Abraham. And it was after these things, and God did test Abraham. Vayomer elav Avram, vayomer hineni. Vayomer kachnat bincha et yichidcha asher ahavta et Yitzchak. V'lech lecha l'eretz Moriah, etc., etc. So anybody who ever studied Rashi, which is probably most of us here, Vayhi achar hadvarim ha'el, and it was after these things. Now on a pshat level, after these things refers to the sending out of Yishmael, which is in the beginning of chapter 21, and the second part of chapter 21, which is after the treaty with Avimelech from Plishtim, Melech Gerar. But what does Rashi say? Vayhi achar hadvarim ha'eleh. Does anyone remember what it says? Someone can look up on their little device what Rashi says. Can someone read to me the first Rashi? Pull it up. Pull it up.
I believe it's saying after son look.
After what?
His son look.
Nope. That's not what I learned when I was in school. What does Rashi say? Everybody has a phone. What do you think Hashem created the phones for? To look up Rashis. Vayhi achar advarim ele. Achar dvarav shel Satan. Is that what you have?
Yes.
What does Satan say? No.
Give the SAR no.
What is the... Don't you guys have good phones? They get it fast? 5G? You're watching too much TikTok. Shaya mikatreg. The Satan was mikatreg. What is mikatreg? He was accusing Abraham of what? Right. He always offered, when everything was good. Keep going. So, right? The Satan said, Abraham did this. It was all good, but take your son. Let's see if he's still willing to... Where the hell, is that in the text? Where is that in the text? Rashi. Every Jewish child from the time Rashi printed that, it's not Rashi, it's a Midrash. Rashi citing, knows that Midrash. Achar dvarav shel Satan. And then, of course, you know that if you continue reading Rashi on the Parsha, Rashi has all kinds of interesting things. The Satan constantly says to Rashi, says to Abraham, what, old man, what are you doing? You're going to kill your son? Right? You know those Rashis? Rashi is very consistent. Ma pito'om the Satan. There's no Satan. There's no Satan. There's no Satan in Sefer Bereshit. There's no Satan in Sefer Shemot. So you're going to tell me where's the Satan? Eov. In the book of Job. This is a story of the book of Job. What happens in the book of Job? The Satan comes to God and says, you think Job is such a tzaddik? Take away his children, take away his wife, and see if he still is willing to worship you. It's mamish, a cut and paste. The Midrashic cut and paste from the story of Job to the... Lama. How can you do that? How can you just cut and paste? And if you're going to cut and paste, why Job? So the answer is very simple. Not so simple. Reverse intertextuality. Because the Job is based on Abraham. How do I know that? Turn to the book of Job. It's in Ketuvim. For those who never studied the book of Iyov. What do we know about Iyov? Ish haya be'eretz utz. There was a man from the land of Oz. Iyov Shemo. That's where Oz comes from. That's where the guy took it from. Iyov Shemo. Ha'ishahu tam v'yashar v'yirei Elohim. He was tam v'yashar v'yirei Elohim. Who is called hitalech lefanai v'heyei tamim? Abraham. Who is ata yadati ki yirei Elohim ata? Abraham. Job is based upon Abraham. In fact, when was the last time we heard of Utz?
Same as Tess said, they were his nephews.
And anybody remembers the Rosh Hashanah davening? That Utz Bechoro. The only other time we have Utz mentioned is it's one of the lands, it's one of the children that are related to Abraham. But more than that, what does our good friend Eov say when all these terrible things happen, when he speaks before God? Does he say it here? If somebody has a concordance, Eov says of himself that he is afar va'efer. Where does Eov say that? Can somebody find? Well, I'll do it myself in my computer.
Paragraph 40.
Thank you. Perek 40 at the denouement, towards the end of the story. So Eov says of himself in chapter 4. Chapter 40. What pasuk?
I found it in chapter 42.
42. When Eov, Vayani Eov et Hashem, after God appears to Eov out of the whirlwind. Vayani Eov et Hashem vayomar yadati ki kol tuchal. Mizeh ma'alim eitzah b'li dat, lacheni gadati lo v'niflot mimeni. Shmana v'adaber. Al kein em'as v'nichamti al afar v'efer. You open up your concordance. Who's the only other person in Tanakh who calls himself Va'anochi Afar Va'efer? It's Abraham when he's arguing with God to save Sodom. I'm sorry? Yeah?
I was going to say Abraham.
Yeah, Abraham. Exactly. In the story of fighting with Sodom, Va'anochi Afar Va'efer. So the Bible clearly presents Job as a second Abraham. He's a second Abraham. He's a person who is modeled, he's Tam, Italech L'fanai V'yei Tamim. He's a person who is Yashar and Yirei Elokim. Atayidati Kir Elokim Ata. He's a person who comes from the land of Utz, which is associated with Abraham's family. He's a person who calls himself Afar Va'efer. And he's a person who goes through this horrible experience, which is a kind of test, right? The Bible, if I'm not mistaken, the Bible uses that word. The Bible says, Hachinam Yarei Eov. Does Eov, you think he's just doing it? He's doing it to get reward. He's doing it because things are going well. Etc., etc. And, okay, I thought I would find one more thing, but I can't find it right now. Okay. Just 1 second. I think even the word nisayon, a test, is used in regarding to Eov as well. I just can't find it right now. But it's pretty clear that Eov is parallel to Abraham.
So Rabbi Helfgot is the...
So if Eov is, 1 second, let me just finish my point and then I'll take. So if Eov is parallel to Abraham, then it makes, I'm sorry, you found it? Oh,
No,
then it
sorry.
makes perfect sense in the Midrashic imagination that if Eov is parallel to Abraham, then maybe things in Abraham's life are parallel to Eov. And that's exactly how this Midrash read the story of the Akedah in the life of Abraham and put the Satan into the Akedah. And what's interesting is it turns the Akedah into a theodicy, which is a fascinating read of the Akedah. I'm not going, that's a sheer in and of itself. This Midrashic take, in effect, transforms the Akedah into a question of good and evil and the nature of God and reward and punishment. It's a very interesting take.
You just said you got the same question from Pshat. You don't need to make
Exactly, but I'm saying, but it just
Makes it
sharpens
deeper,
it,
yeah.
sharpens it as a Eov. Yes, I'm sorry.
Just putting on another connection, we have with Abraham and the Midrash, with Abraham we have Ur Kasim and all the comments on it, and the very first test for Eov is Eish Elohim nafla min hashemayim, followed by kasdim, samu shlosha rashim.
No doubt about it. There's an echo of kasdim, right? I'm saying if you go through the book of Iyov, you'll find other parallels. Just to give you an example. Again, one second, then I'll take. When Iyov speaks to his friends and he talks about how I never, what's the pasuk? I'm sorry, I'm not a bucky in the book of Iyov, but I wasn't thinking about this, but there's a pasuk, pares la ra'ev lachmecha. So it talks about, Iyov says, look, I never turned away someone who came to my house for food. I never turned away anybody who was hungry. I always invited them in. Which of course is a fascinating, Iyov says about himself, he was Mr. Hachnasas Orchim. I mean, who's Mr. Hachnasas Orchim? Abraham. I'm sorry, you found it?
Is it Legever Asher Darkon Nistada?
No. It's in the middle. It's in one of the 20s or 30s. One of those chapters. So it's that's another example. There are many other examples if you go through the book of Iyov carefully, where clearly there's echoes of the text is trying to present him as Abraham. So if he's like Abraham, so we can learn about Abraham from Iyov. Yes, I'm sorry, you had a question, Shlomo.
Yeah, this is fascinating. So, but I forget the term.
That's the goal.
Intertextuality, reverse?
Intertextuality is when a later story is clearly being patterned on an earlier story. Like Eliyahu goes to Har HaKarmel for 40 days. And he goes to Chorev without eating for 40 days. He's clearly trying to be a second Moses. When Lahavdil Elef Avdalos, Jesus is, goes and does this and does that. He's clearly trying to be a second Moses or a second Eliyahu in order to speak to Jewish consciousness, right? Okay? So that's intertextuality. One later story is based on an early story. What I'm trying to show you is that there's also a reverse intertextuality.
So
then we go back.
Got it. So in modern parlance,
That's pretty modern, yeah.
We could say Abraham is channeling his inner Job. Abraham is channeling his inner Gidon.
Yeah, I just don't like that formulation. I'd rather it's a literary statement. Chazal, the Midrash, the Book of Jubilees, is reading Abraham as a Job-like figure. You could say it that way. I mean, I don't know, that Abraham channeling sounds like too much. I don't know what Abraham himself, I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in how Chazal read Abraham. How Chazal read the life and times.
I'm just trying to make it more psychological.
Say that, but I'm saying I don't want to even get into that. I'm interested in what Chazal did to the figure of Abraham. Yeah.
So I guess now my question is, what's the point of now? So let's say Abraham that Chazal is reading the story as Abraham as a similar story to.
So we get two. I said at the beginning we get two great things. Number one, we get an origin story. We know that our heroes can't just emerge in the consciousness of people. People in every culture, right? Heroes have to have certain criterion to be heroes.
For us to believe in them?
Yeah, to us to identify with them, for us to learn from them. Yeah, that's why we have Gedolim stories, and that's why we have stories about Chassidish Rebbes and stuff. We get motivated by that. Number two, it also helps explain why is Avraham chosen. It's a very mysterious question. We understand why Moshe is chosen. We don't understand why Avraham is chosen. Why is Avraham the father? Why are we B'nai Avraham? Yitzchak v'Yaakov. So it solves those two very important, I think, needs, both psychological needs, theological needs, of trying to understand what it is that makes Avraham so special.
And now let's say that if we have such a parallel story between Avraham and Gidon, what is the story of Gidon even at? Is that?
No, it's just now that when I study Gidon, I learn about Gidon in and of himself, that Gidon was a very major figure, and it adds to the strength of his character that he's a kind of second Avraham in certain ways. I mean, why does it add to the fact? What do I need? Why does Eliyahu have to not eat for 40 days and 40 nights? It's clear that the Chumash is trying to say, the Tanakh is trying to say, Eliyahu comes with him. He's continuing the work of Moshe. He's not a break from Moshe. He is affirming the Nevuat Moshe. When Yeshayahu starts the book of Yeshayahu, Chazon Yeshayahu ben Amos, Asher Chazal Yudal Yushalayim, and he starts with Ha'azinu Hashamayim v'adabeira v'tishma. I'm sorry. The other way. How does Shimu Shamayim v'azini eretz ki pi Hashem diber, which is clearly a reversal of Hazinu et Hashamayim v'taretz. What's he doing? What, he had no other narrative to play off? No, what he's saying is, I'm continuing the work of Moshe. I'm not coming on my own. I'm not a New Testament. I am a continuation of Moshe. Therefore, Nevi'im will echo previous tropes, previous themes. When Yeshayahu talks about how the future Geula is going to use language that reminds us of Gan Eden, or uses language that reminds us of Yetzias Mitzrayim, that's the way Tanakh works. Tanakh is saying, the second redemption will be like the first redemption, or even greater. When he talks in Perek Yud Aleph, Yeshayahu talks about Vigar Ze'evim Keves, that the lamb will lie down with the lion, and a little child will walk amongst them. And he finishes off the pasuk that most people don't remember. And a little child will put his hand into the hole of the snake and not be bitten. You can't not read that and say, oh wow, we're going back to Gan Eden. The animals don't eat each other. The prey and the predator don't eat each other. Everybody just eats grass. Habakar, right? The lion will eat grass like right? That's what it says. We're going back to Gan Eden. And that's why he mentions the snake. Whoa, mapitom snakes. We're talking about lions and tigers and bears. But the child will play with the snake. When was the last time human beings and the snakes were not at each other's throat? That comes from Gan Eden. We're going to reverse. That's powerful. That's Tanakh. Da-da-da-da. Isn't that great? Yeah.
Is this intertextuality your chiddush?
Intertextuality is not my chiddush. Reverse intertextuality is a little bit of my chiddush in this case, but it's becoming more and more understood, and there's more and more people talking about it. So there's a lot of people doing it at the same time. Meaning,
Who talked about it? Who introduced?
I don't know who reverse intertextuality has been going on since the time of the Midrash. The Midrash noticed that Eliyahu, the Midrash says, Midrash on Yalkut Shimoni, look it up tonight. Eliyahu and Moshe, there are 12 parallels.
But the Midrash didn't
do it always systematically.
And Avraham together.
Correct. The Midrash
didn't put Iyun.
Correct. Correct.
So who put that together?
Well, the Midrash does. There are Midrashim that talk about Eov and Avraham being similar. There are. They don't always notice every single thing, but they are Midrashim like that. It's just not always systematic, like going through every single narrative, every single story and doing it. But this has become a trope of what we call, of the people that you come to listen to in, Rabbi Silber and Menachem Leibtag and Rav Yoel Ben Nun and Rav Meizdan and Rabbi Foreman. That's what we all do. That's what we get paid the not big bucks for. We get paid the not big bucks for doing intertext, of showing patterns, of echoes, of exactly the Tanakh.
Does it with Yosef.
Not just with Yosef, with Shmuel, with Yosef, with everybody. And you hear echoes of everything. But the reverse intertextuality is more of a chiddush. That's more of a chiddush because it has to do more with Chazal, of Midrash. What they did once they saw the intertextuality, the reverse. Yes, I'm sorry. Somebody had a question. Yeah.
It's fascinating, and I like the idea of the reverse because what you're showing us is in Tanakh versus Midrash.
Exactly.
Not in Tanakh.
Exactly.
So this, in a way, seems like more reliable source.
Right.
However, when you go backwards in time in order to fill in the blanks,
Right.
it feels a little bit more like the biblical criticism Avraham never existed, and we are filling in the blanks from later stuff.
Okay. I mean, okay. What am I going to say?
It doesn't bother me personally.
No, I'm saying, I'm trying to understand the project of Chazal. I'm not here to, to give tziyunim, whether it's historical or it's not historical. To me, it's like really, like it's not going to change how I speak to my 96-year-old mother tomorrow. Whether like
So whether Avraham existed or these particulars actually happened to him versus
you don't. Who cares?
Like, don't care.
I really don't. I mean, I think Avraham existed. I think Avraham existed. Do I care whether he destroyed idols or not? I don't think so. I definitely think it's important that in the mindset of Chazal. Now, whether each Chazal believed, and that's another interesting question. Did Rashi believe that the Satan actually spoke to? I don't know what Rashi believed. Maybe yes. I think he probably did because he lived in a different world. Peter Berger, he lived in an enchanted world which we don't live in anymore. That's true. Doesn't matter, but it's irrelevant to me. Really. Yes.
This is beautiful. I'm not taking anything away from this. I'm also interested in what Chazal is thinking. And the question that perturbs me is, why did they throw Terach under the bus?
Right.
What did he do wrong?
Right.
I mean, we could just say Abraham was the first, but why make Terach a Russia?
Right.
Terach,
The break is
Terach was the guy who started to go to Canaan.
Right.
Anyone saying
Correct.
Right.
And the Ramban actually has a much more nuanced picture of Terach when you read
It's
it.
more like Yoash. He happened to.
Yeah.
Yeshua makes him Russia.
Yeah, the Yoshua says he was an Ovdei Avodah Zarah. But everybody was an Ovdei Avodah Zarah then, right?
Sure, but from the perspective of Avram,
So what?
Avram is a break, right? It adds the break.
Midrash.
Yeah.
So like.
Yes.
One thing this kind of thing reminds me of that also made address the comment raised earlier is one of the principles sometimes collected in terms of the Midrashic principles extended from the ones to halacha
Right.
is habal lamod v'yatsa lamad.
Right.
And one of the examples given of that is when the Navi says, in the end of times, God is going to smooth your way by filling in the valleys and cutting
Right.
out the hills, just like he did back in Mitzrayim.
Right.
And we're like, oh wow, he did that in Mitzrayim?
Exactly.
And you
Right.
could read this as a similar kind of notion, that because the Navi is setting up Gidon to be like Abraham, we can infer that perhaps
Right.
they're setting it up in other ways, and we're learning things about Abraham that weren't in the text.
It's just
but they had in
it's
Midrash at
right.
the
It's
time.
just a jump because there it says like it was in the
Yeah,
days of
it's
old.
explicit.
Right. Like it was. Like when a later text says like it was. Yeah. So sometimes like the text holds back information until later. Like for example, when Joseph. When the brothers find the Gavia and it says, "Oh, Ashemim anachnu al asher," we heard our brothers crying out and we didn't respond. In the actual story, we never find that out. It's only later it holds back that information for greater effect. Now they finally hear what they heard all along, but now it really has an impact on them. But it's a little bit different.
Also,
But yeah,
also say it as this is the Midrash of the time. That
Right.
Presumably that was a tradition. And I don't think the Navi was coming
Right.
and telling people out of nowhere, I'm telling you something cool you never knew about Mitzrayim.
correct. Yes, Charlie.
Going back to circling back, I guess, to the end of the original Avram story, I can imagine that after, running through these patterns, it would be meaningful to look at within the Tanakh, let's say, differences between the two, and like if you have all these similarities, where are they different? Is it meaningful to do the same with narratives here, like with the origin story that, like Haran exists here, you have a brother.
Right.
Are those details meaningful when?
Right, I don't know. I can't give, I'm not in the lab when they create it, right? So I don't know the answer, but maybe. I think details do matter. How much? I don't know the answer. Okay, thank you everybody for your hakshava.